Well, hello. Glad we get the opportunity to start a new study in the book of Ruth. And so we're actually going to go through a couple of books over the course of this series. This might seem like an odd transition to go from Ecclesiastes to Ruth, but these books are actually connected in the Hebrew scriptures. If you look at the Hebrew Bible, it's divided into kind of three categories. You've got the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament. You've got the prophets, which is both the former prophets of the history books and the latter prophets. And then you've got this kind of third category called the writings. And this includes the wisdom literature, it includes Psalms, but it also includes this group of 5 books called the Megillot. And these 5 books were actually used for the festivals that the Hebrews would celebrate. And so festivals of Tabernacle, the Feast of Weeks, different things like this, they would actually use these 5 books in celebration of those weeks. And they would read these out to commemorate these special events. And so Ecclesiastes is one of those 5. Now we're going to take a look at the book of Ruth. And so kind of following that line of thinking, that might explain why we have what seems to be a random transition here. But the book of Ruth is a really important book in the Old Testament studies, particularly because it accomplishes so much in such a short little book. And so understanding this book, going perhaps a little bit deeper than some of the surface level readings that we can sometimes do, is going to glean a lot of fruit for us in understanding not just this individual book, but the overall storyline of the Old Testament. Ruth fits into an incredible picture there. I want to again thank, we're joined by Trey Haskett from Tupelo, Mississippi, and Greg Kline from Birmingham, Alabama. Thoroughly enjoyed doing the Ecclesiastes study with these guys. Very excited to dive into a study of the book of Ruth with them. And so we're going to go ahead and dive in. We're going to do this a little bit differently than what we did with the text of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes, there's a lot of in-depth information from the text that we need to talk about, so we kind of read through each passage. Here, we're going to kind of assume a little bit more familiarity with the text. If you have not read Ruth before, this would be a good time to pause the video. Go ahead and read chapter 1. It's not an extensive reading, but we're going to be kind of going through this text a little bit more organically than just going verse by verse on this. And so with that in mind, Greg, go ahead and get us started off with Ruth 1 as we talk about kind of the background and some of the introduction materials. Talk to us a little bit about when the book of Ruth is going on here.
Yeah, I think it's going to be pretty important. And while the organic nature is going to be beneficial, I do think reading verse 1 is helpful here. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and the man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. And we'll talk about the family involved here in a moment. But you see in verse 1, that's a very important marker from a biblical history standpoint, that Ruth takes place in the days when the judges ruled. Not a lot of evidence pointing exactly where and what time period Ruth lived in outside of the period of the judges. But perhaps just for a marker, think maybe around the time of Gideon. And so when you're thinking around the time of Gideon or even the book of Judges at large, you have to remember the very last verse in the book of Judges. In chapter 21, verse 25, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. When it comes to that particular verse, that pretty well encapsulates a lot of what's going on in the book of Judges. In chapter 2 of that book, there was a generation that arose that did not know God or how to honor him as God. And that's a real problem. And so you think about Judges and you remember this constant pattern, right? The cycle that the Israelites had where things were good and then they rebel against God. And so then they're punished and they cry out and God sends them a judge and they're saved, and then the judge dies and then they're the worst again. And Ruth is really the opposite of that kind of story. Here you meet people who are kind of like remnant Israel, and you'll see that they go out and don't find satisfaction. They can't find what they're looking for because without God, there is no hope. And yet Ruth, of all people, this outsider from an Israelite standpoint, would become part of Christ's family. That's amazing. What this book is going to show us is that God has a great amount of mercy and grace, that his concept of family goes beyond the first concept of the Old Covenant and just Jewish family being loved by God. That's not it at all. And what we'll see is that even if we think we're on the inside, that type of language is destructive when God intended that his message always go to all kinds of people, that anyone who does what is right can be pleasing to him. And so you're going to have Naomi in this story who's going to typify people of Israel who left their country and they've lost everything. And yet Ruth is, on the other hand, kind of that remnant picture of someone who has no natural rights to God, and yet she comes back. Very opposite of the story of Judges, people who should have known everything, who God had done everything for, and yet they constantly left him. Ruth is the complete opposite of that. In fact, there's a lot of this type of an analogy in the scripture of Ruth, and one of those is famine. Trey, talk to us a little bit about the famine land and that picture that it paints for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Greg, one of the things that you had mentioned was that Naomi and this family that they're in this time period of the judges, everybody's doing what's right in their own eyes. God is the one who provides, and without God providing, they really don't have anything. But they leave during this time of famine. That's really important because it connects us to several other stories in the Bible. The Bible does this very often. It sort of paints these common themes, these common scenes, really. Maybe we think about like a Western, say, in our modern media. We're very familiar with sort of the Western category of film. We know sort of the types of places that takes place and what goes on there. And, it's the guy with the white hat that wins, and he's the good guy, versus all the guy with the black hats. Well, the book of Ruth is setting that up here, first with what Greg mentioned, that it's in the time of the judges, but also there's this famine in the land. And this is something that we see throughout scripture, that famine, it's a time of testing. What do you do when there's famine in the land? What do you do when God isn't providing, or it doesn't seem that God is providing? Do you run away to greener pastures, quite literally? And that's what happens. Maybe you remember that in the case with Sarah and Abraham, when they are faced with a famine, and so they decide to go down to the land of Egypt. Well, it doesn't go too well for them in the land of Egypt. Or the same thing that happens with Isaac and Rebekah later on in the book of Genesis, that there's this famine in the land, and so then they go out of the promised land that they were supposed to be in. They go down to Gerar. And this is this common thing that goes on, this common thing that happens in the scripture, and it seems to be a period of testing, a period where faithfulness and faith are tested, and sometimes people pass that test, sometimes they don't, and so that kind of sets us up here again with something that Greg was talking about, sort of our low bar of expectations, with everybody doing what's right in their own eyes, the period of the judges being a very immoral period. It's got all that going on, and now you've got this family that has left the promised land in search of greener pastures because they're not trusting in God to provide. And here's the little cherry on top for that. The name Bethlehem, and the Hebrew is important in this just for this reason. It means house of bread. And so there's some irony here at the beginning of this story, that in a place where it's supposed to be a house of bread, a place that's abundantly provided for, now there's nothing. And that kind of fits with the sort of tacit judgment we see in the book of Judges, where they go through these cycles where they are being oppressed, or they're lacking something. They're facing drought, they're facing famine, they're facing pestilence, all these sorts of things to show us not everything is sunny in this promised land, and not everything is sunshine and rainbows with this family either. And so they go off to the land of Moab. Andrew, do you have something more to say about Moab in general?
Yeah, so this is going to be one of the key themes that we're going to see in the book of Ruth. And Greg has kind of already alluded to this idea of a foreigner, this idea of someone who is not an Israelite. When we read the book of Ruth, Greg did a great job setting the context of the story, but from kind of a canon perspective, as far as the actual writing of the book of Ruth, it seems like Ruth was actually more than likely a post-exilic document. So that means it's being written during this time period after the Babylonian exile of Judah, during this reign of the Persian Empire. And what it seems to be really emphasizing is the idea of foreign inclusion into the covenant. And that's a really controversial topic in the Old Testament scriptures, because there's obviously the passages in Deuteronomy that talk about the idea that idolaters are not to be entered into the covenant because they are not willing to commit to Yahweh as their sole God. And so there's a lot of destruction of idolatrous foreign nations as Israel comes in to conquer the land, as they're fighting through these things. But there's also this kind of growing sentiment in the post-exilic period. It's this question of, where do foreigners fit in? We see this as a struggle of the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. We see that the prophetic book of Jonah kind of asks some of the similar questions of the idea, where does foreigners fit into the idea of Israel's relationship with God? Does Israel have a right to claim supremacy over a foreigner in their relationship with God? And Ruth, I think, is kind of part of this same subversive genre that Naomi and her family of Israelites would be the people that you would expect to know God very well. You would expect them to be the ones to trust in God's promises, to rely upon that covenant relationship, and they're not the ones that do that. Ruth, on the other hand, a foreigner, and not just a foreigner, but a Moabite, is the one who actually trusts in God. And that's a really big deal. If you look over just real briefly in Deuteronomy, one of the things you're going to see in Deuteronomy chapter 23 is that Moabites were really specifically called out as one of these groups of people that Israel was not to have affiliation with. In Deuteronomy chapter 23 and verse 3, Moses says, "No Ammonite or Moabite shall enter the assembly of the Lord, none of their descendants, even to the 10th generation, shall ever enter the assembly of the Lord, because they did not meet you with food and water on the way when you came out of Egypt, and because they hired against you Balaam the son of Beor from Pethor of Mesopotamia to curse you. Nevertheless, the Lord your God was not willing to listen to Balaam, but the Lord your God turned the curse into a blessing for you, because the Lord your God loves you. You shall never seek their peace or their prosperity all your days." And so there is a natural enmity between the Moabites and the Israelites. The Moabites were some of the people who dealt with these issues of Balaam. And if you recall that story in Numbers, the Moabites ended up being the ones that Balaam used to seduce the Israelites. And so in Israelite culture, the Moabites kind of have this perspective of being kind of the femme fatale, kind of this seductive figure of a woman. And so for Ruth then to come in, we're going to see that Ruth is the total opposite of that. Ruth is a subversion of that trope of the idea of kind of the Moabite seductress. And most importantly, as we're going to see, not to jump too far ahead in spoilers, but the end of this book links all of the discussion of Ruth and Boaz into the line of David, and as Greg alluded to, the line of Christ. Well, if we're looking at that Deuteronomy passage, that means David shouldn't even be in the assembly. So there's something going on here, that there is an intentional revelation that David, and subsequently Christ, has a Moabite in his line. And there's going to be reasons for that, and there's significance to that. And that's part of what this book is exploring, is how is God redeeming the nations outside of Israel, and how is Israel supposed to respond to that? So as we get into this, we're kind of talking about this family that we're specifically looking at. And so, Trey, why don't you talk a little bit to us about this family? We've mentioned Naomi, but there's a couple of other characters that are going to be important for a few moments and then really quickly disappear. Tell us a little bit about them.
Yeah, just really quick. One of the key ways that the Bible keys us into what's going on with some of these characters is that it gives us their names. And typically these names are very heavily weighted. There's a lot of freight that these names carry within the function of the narrative itself. And so it happens to be the case here as well. We're probably most familiar with Naomi, and we talk about that a little bit here. But this happens with the other characters as well, that their names become very important. And so just for example, when we get into verse 2, it says, the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi. Now, the name Elimelech actually means God is my king. And yet, from what we've seen thus far in the book of Ruth and what we're going to see with this family, this man takes his family, he goes to a foreign country, goes out of the promised land, leaves the land that God has promised to provide for his people in, and he goes to a foreign nation. And so already what we're seeing with the father figure in this family is that not everything is quite right. And I think we're meant to read that there as well. One of the things that's interesting as we get to verse 3, just really quickly before we jump in on a couple of the other these names, is that verse 3, it says, but Elimelech, the husband of Naomi. And maybe that doesn't jump out to us very much, but it should, at least it would have for the original readers, because never, hardly ever, I should say, is the husband called the husband of such and such. It's always, this person is the wife of such and such. And so Andrew mentioned the fact that some of these names are given really quickly. Elimelech comes into the story just as quickly as he goes out of it, because the story is going to shift and it's going to talk about Naomi, and Naomi is going to take center stage in this story here at the fore. But Greg, there's a couple other names here in this family that I think are important. The sons Mahlon and Chilion. You want to say something about those guys?
Yeah, I think it's interesting what you pointed out about the subversion, more to use Andrew's word there. This entire story is a subversion of the expected, of the expectation. And so when you look at Mahlon, for example, his name would mean something like sickness, and Chilion would mean something akin to consumption. And so what are they living for? What are they living about? Well, selfish reasons, selfish gain. Remember with Naomi, she's going to kind of be the natural Israelite of the story. And what does she do? Well, she starts out with this name of pleasantness or sweetness. And when you come to the end of the chapter, if you look at, it's in verse 21, she went away full and the Lord has brought me back empty. Well, what did that do? In verse 20, she said, I don't want to be called Naomi anymore. I'm going to be called Mara, which basically means what? Well, the opposite of the original essentially is bitter or bitterness. That is going to be the cost of the application Trey has been talking about capably, the idea of not trusting in God, of when we live, what do we expect to happen? Well, if we expect the good things but don't trust in God to get them, that doesn't leave us in a great spot. Ruth is going to show, though, what really matters is how we serve, who we love, and what we're dedicated to. That's a very important foundational difference. What bloodline you're in, that doesn't mean anything. What your life experiences have been up until this point doesn't mean anything either. God watches out for those people who truly devote themselves to him, not to selfish causes, not to different family lineage or bloodlines. He cares about his people caring about him and trusting in him. And so, Andrew, as you look at Ruth, for example, and her namesake, it makes a big impact on the story, doesn't it?
Yeah, so you're going to see as we kind of get into the bulk of the text here, you're going to see that these Israelite characters that, again, we would expect to be the center point of the story. We would expect Elimelech, again, with his name of God as king. We would expect him to be a powerful story. And again, remember, from a reader's perspective, they're going to hear a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah, and they're immediately primed to think like, oh, okay, this is important because Judah's the line of kings. Bethlehem is the city of David. Remember, the readers are reading this after, because we're going to see David's name brought up at the end of the text. They're well aware of the connotations. And then Elimelech dies, Mahlon dies, and Gilead dies. We're like, oh, no, wait. So all the potential like hero characters, they're all dead. And now you're left with these three women. And again, that's already subversive because most of the time women are not the central characters. And again, following up in the period of Judges, you know, a story of the Levite's concubine where women have been awfully abused and mistreated. And so this is already subverting our expectations that these three women now become the center role. But we're also even surprised to see how Naomi handles this situation. We see as we get into verses really 6 through 13, Naomi is going to do something that's very encouraging at first, but then also very surprising. What happens is that after the famine is done, after everything is kind of going back, Naomi says, okay, I'm going to go back to the promised land, which again, we probably would have preferred that she was there from the beginning, but she's going back to the promised land at least. But then she tells her daughters, don't come with me. Don't return with me. And it's interesting to see her response. She says in verse 8, after her two daughters are preparing to go with her, they're prepared to go. They're prepared to go and be Israelites. We're going to talk about that in just a second. Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law in verse 8, go return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. May the Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. She kissed them and they lifted up their voices and wept. They said to her, no, but we will surely return with you to your people. But Naomi said, return, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may be your husband? Return, my daughters, go, for I am too old to have a husband. If I said I had hope, if I should even have a husband tonight and also bear sons, would you therefore wait until they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is harder for me than for you, for the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me. And so we're seeing this really odd response from Naomi, where she's saying, well, I'm not going to be able to have children. And even if I did have a child right this second, you'd have to wait, 18, 20 years to marry him. And so her response is, go back home. And that might not seem like that big of a deal to us. From a modern American culture, we're like, okay, well, she's just saying she doesn't have the capacity to support them. Like, okay, that's fine. But remember, this is a much more different culture. And where you lived, whose house you were a part of, was intimately tied with who your God was. And so she's telling them point blank, she's actually going to make it even more significant later in her commentary to Ruth. She's going to say, go back to your gods. This is an Israelite woman who has such regard for her daughters-in-law that she's telling them, go back to being a Moabite. go back to being servants of whatever God it may be, Chemosh or any other different God. Go back to serve them. Don't come serve Yahweh with me. You go serve Chemosh. That's how little her relationship with God means. That's a really, really big red flag as to the character of who Naomi is. And so that's kind of the surprising thing to see here, is Naomi, the three Israelite men are weak and have all died. Naomi is weak in spirit. And so that's kind of setting the stage for us. But what that makes even more incredible then is the response that is given to this. So Greg, what are you seeing here in this text?
I think that response and everything you said there keys up the story of Ruth so powerfully, because you track this. And yes, the story is a lot about the namesake Ruth. Yes, Ruth is going to make good decisions. And I'll highlight something about that right before I hand it over to Trey again. But go back to verse. Why did Naomi want to go back? Yes, the husband had died. Yes, the sons had died. Verse 6, though, she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. Right? God provides for his people. This is what makes it such a red flag, to use that terminology, that she would then tell them in verse 8, go return each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you. Well, wait, what? God deals kindly with the people who seek him. And Naomi's saying, hey, God's over here. You go over there. Well, that doesn't add up exactly, right? Verse 9 again, the Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. So her focus is physical care, right? You go find someone who'll just take care of you. That's what matters. Pretty much everything else seems to be kind of optional, right? Andrew, to what you were saying. And as you look at Naomi, that's not a great paragon of virtue really for us. But then you come down to verse 15, and you have Ruth, of course, who is clinging to her. But notice what Ruth says in response to Naomi in 16 even. Do not urge me to leave you or return from following you, for where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. These next two phrases are very powerful. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. It sounds generic, right? Like Naomi's kind of spiritual in the sense that she doesn't want to die, and she heard that there is a God that she's used to hearing about who provided food, right? But Ruth takes it to another level in verse 17. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. That phrase of the Lord is an understanding of Jehovah, not just some Israelite God. Did Ruth know everything about God? Maybe, maybe not. Did she know anything about what it means to be a child of God? Maybe, maybe not. But it does say that she's dedicated to staying with Naomi, who really doesn't seem to have a whole lot of things that she's holding on to that are keeping her anchored. Ruth says, I'm going to be where you're going to be. And most importantly, the Lord, Jehovah, is in control. What we need to see in Ruth is that God is in control. And when he shows that control, who does he care for? All of his children. His children are not necessarily limited to those physically related to Abraham. Right now, there's a special covenant in the Old Testament that we study, right? The law of Moses that is for God and his people, the Israelites. But has that ever been the only people he's cared for? No. You see this in all kinds of stories. You see this in the story of Jonah. You see this now in the story of Ruth. God not only cares for other people, he cared for them so much if they would seek him that Jesus even comes in the lineage of this, yes, Moabite. Right? That's a really powerful difference, that Ruth could see something about this God, and more importantly, that she showed a loyalty to him as God, calling him by name, but also sticking with Naomi. That's interesting. Now, that's not necessarily what Orpah did, Trey, and that's not necessarily what Naomi was intending. There's a lot going on in the context right before that and right after. What do you see standing out to you?
Yeah, just real quick. We mentioned some of the names of these people, and Orpah's got an interesting name too. Her name means possibly something like the back of a neck or something. And again, we even see how that's working out this story as she kind of eventually, at the behest of her mother, she ends up turning her back and going back to her homeland, whereas Ruth has done the opposite. She's clung to her. And so again, these names, they actually work out what's going on in the story. But one of the things you said, Greg, that I really want to touch on is the fact that God provides. And the sort of ironic thing about the book of Ruth, it's similar to the book of Esther, which is another one of the books that we're gonna cover in this series. But one of the things about the book of Ruth is that God actually doesn't have a front and center role. he's talked about a lot. He comes up on the lips of the people a lot, which is sort of a difference than what we find in the book of, say, Esther, where he's not even mentioned, but entirely behind the scenes. The same thing is true here, where, so Naomi hears that God has provided abundance, and so that's where she's going to go back to. Well, then God doesn't actually have an action associated with his name in this book until the very end, when he's blessed Ruth and given her this abundant, fruitful womb out of which David will come, out of which the Christ will come. And so that's going to be very important. God's actions sort of behind the scenes. And so we've got human decisions and human interactions, human encounters on the one hand, and then behind all of that, we've got God working and God's purposes, God's plans working themselves out as well. And so seeing that confluence of human action and divine providence coming together, I think that's really, really neat here in the book of Ruth. One of the things, though, and this gets back to something that both of you guys have touched on, and the fact that it's not about bloodline. It's not about the fact that we have the same lineage, the same bloodline, in order to be the people of God or to be made right with God. That's been something that's been true of God's people from page 1 of the book of Genesis, and it's through all the way out, all the way through the Old Testament, as well as into the New. One of the subtle ways we see that is in verse 11, where he says, "Have I not yet sons in my womb, or have I yet sons in my womb, that they may become your husbands?" And what Naomi is referring to here is this idea of levirate marriage. That is, it comes from the Latin word lever, which is brother-in-law. Not important, other than to say it's this idea that the brother-in-law would marry the wife of a deceased brother in order to carry on the lineage, in order to grant rights and heritage to not only the wife, she's getting some benefit from that, but also the offspring as well, and the name is carried on. So all of that becomes very important in this book about bloodlines, because Naomi has no one to offer for Ruth. And in fact, that actually connects back to a previous story. We talk about all these touch points in the book of Ruth, connects back to a previous story in Genesis chapter 38, which is where we see the first account of levirate marriage. And almost verbatim, the same thing is said by Judah, who had some sons that were pretty immoral, wicked people. God ended up punishing them, taking them off the map because they were just terrible people. And so Judah's daughter-in-law, Tamar, is left childless. And what Judah promises her is that he is going to allow his son, when he grows up and becomes of age, he's a really young boy at this point, he's going to allow her to marry his son. Well, that's going to become important, because the sons that she bears, one of them is Perez. And Perez is going to come up at the end of this book. And the genealogy is actually going to go through him. And so bloodlines are even being subverted in that. And we'll talk a lot more about that by the time we get to chapter 4. But just keep that in mind here, that bloodlines really aren't all that important. And what matters is this faithfulness, or this kindness that we see being done, this good character that we see here in the book of Ruth. Andrew, do you want to say something further? You've talked a lot about this idea of serving other gods, and that Naomi sends Ruth back to her own household to serve her own gods. But what about her dedication, and what about her vow to come with Naomi and to serve Naomi's gods? Do you have something to add there?
Yeah, I think it's significant when you see just the sheer level of dedication that she's offering here. And when you look at that vow, where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There I will be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me, and worse, if anything but death parts you and me. You see that Ruth is really saying, from letter A to letter Z, whatever is going to occur, we're going to be there, and I'm going to be there with you. And this is a level of dedication that is just beyond admirable, especially because it is very clear Naomi has nothing to offer to Ruth. There is no hope of a future marriage. There's no hope of a son. There's nowhere that she's going back to receive. She doesn't have her land in Israel to fall back on or something. She's essentially committing to a life of destitution right now. She's committing to a life of having to go be a beggar in Israel instead of going back to her father's house. It's very likely that Ruth is probably, late 20s, maybe early 30s at the absolute latest, could very easily go and find a new husband in Moab. But she really is genuinely not only dedicated to Naomi, but she's clearly dedicated to Yahweh. We're not given much indication of exactly how Ruth has become so dedicated to Yahweh, because again, so far we haven't exactly been impressed with the family she's been married into, but something has rubbed off on her that she recognizes the value of loyalty. She recognizes the value of allegiance, not just to Naomi, but to Yahweh himself. And then I think it's fascinating. And again, gives us a clear indication of Naomi's character, that after one of the most impressive declarations of love and fealty that's recorded in all of the Bible, it says, after she says this in verse 18, when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. Naomi doesn't say, wow, thank you so much for coming with me. I don't have much to offer, but I'm so glad you're here with me. She just turns around and starts walking away. She's like, okay, fine, if you're just going to come with me. It's such a jarring reaction from, again, and if we're thinking about this from kind of typological standpoints, it's so jarring to see Israel react like this to God's presence. This is, if we're looking at this from a large scale picture, this is an example of what Israel does. That God, not because he has to, not because Israel has earned it in some capacity, but even in the midst of their destitution, just like Trey pointed out that God has provided for the land of Israel and given them food, God's providing for Naomi here. He's given her this incredible daughter-in-law who is loyal to her and faithful and true. And Naomi just kind of turns her nose up at it. And she comes back to Bethlehem, and everybody's like, oh, it's good to see Naomi. And she's like, I have nothing. I'm Mara. I'm bitter. And, Ruth is walking there behind her, having stayed with her this entire time. And Naomi's like, God has taken everything away from me. Our best child is the one who has stayed with her and who is faithful to her. And it shows what Israel's relationship with God has been, that God gives them these incredible blessings and this incredible opportunity to love and to serve and to work with him. And they're just like, our God is so difficult to get along with. He's just so abusive towards us. And it's meant to be almost absurd the way that we see this, but that's making the point for us that a lot of times we look at this, we're like, oh man, we really see ourselves in Ruth. We need to see ourselves in Naomi sometimes too. That this is how we respond to God's blessings a lot of time. That God gives us the things that we're praying for. He gives us the things that we're asking for. Naomi clearly from this text, and we're going to see it in a future text, the thing she wants most is a child. The thing she wants most is a child to carry on her name. And she's given that. She's given Ruth. She's given the child that clearly Mahlon and Gilead really hadn't been for her. But she can't see it because it's not the way that she wants it. She wants things her way and her way done. And if it's not, then it's all God's fault. And God's just holding everything back from her. And that should indict us to our quick. And it should make us analyze, are we like that with God's blessings? Do we interact with God on that level, that if God won't do it our way, then he's just a bad God who's just not really looking out for us? And so as we're kind of getting kind of into our wrap up of this first chapter, I'll throw it back to Trey. What else are you seeing here as far as kind of closing thoughts and applications of this chapter?
Yeah, things that I see in this book is it's all about reversal, and it's all about growth, and it's all about transformation. And so, we've got that name Mara here, as you mentioned. She's bitter and she's blaming God for where she's at. Toward the end of the book, if we can get just a little bit of spoiler alert, she's going to have a different reaction at that point. And God is going to right the situation. He's going to reverse the situation. That's who he is. He's the God of divine reversal. He looks on those who are oppressed. He looks on those who are in less than ideal circumstances, and he blesses them. That is who he is. He's the God who provides. But one of the things that I think is important for us to see, and maybe this is a struggle for some of us as we're reading through this, are making these points. I don't know about you, but it's kind of hard for me to hear Naomi and light and see her in this way. But I think what this text does for us, and I think what close readings of narratives in Scripture do for us, is to help us to see that these aren't just flat characters. These aren't just people that are thrown in and perfect from day one, and they never make any mistakes, and they always view things the right way. And that's not to say that that rubber stamps any of our weaknesses or unrighteousness or anything like that. But it is to say there's something about being human. And again, as the human concern and the divine providence, as those two things come together, that's God's way of shaping us and making us who he would have us to be. And so we see Naomi where she is right now, and it's not a very attractive place, but God's going to do something with that. And so maybe if you're at home and you're listening to this and you're thinking about this and yeah, maybe I am sort of an Eeyore, right? I sort of take everything that God has given me and I just kind of grumble about it. Maybe that's where I'm at. And maybe I don't demonstrate the greatest faithfulness in my life, or whatever, barometer you're using to measure that. God can do something with that. God can do something with you if we will but open our eyes and see what he's trying to work in our lives. And so that's really my takeaway, is be ready for God to change you and to transform you from where you are right now to where he wants to take you. Greg, you have any last thoughts or applications?
Yeah, I think y'all hit kind of both sides of the same coin. On the one hand, we need to make sure we're thankful for what God has done. The Israelites had that problem over and over. They would be out of Egyptian bondage, and what would they complain about? Well, I wish we were back in bondage. It was better there. Now we're going to die by the sword. Right? Then they're out of food, and the complaint is, well, I know you've won these battles for us, and we're no longer slaves, but now we're going to die of hunger. Now we're going to die of thirst. There's always something to worry about. On the other hand, Naomi now is upset because her life's not going well. And I would just say an application here quickly. What do we do when facing tough times? Because keep in mind, Ruth and Naomi have both lost a husband. Now, has Naomi's loss been greater, so to speak? Yes. But she has arguably one of the most valuable Old Testament characters pledging loyalty to her. That's amazing. And it's like Andrew said, then she gets into the village and says, I have nothing. You're like, wow, that hurts. That's cold. Even for an Israelite, that's a cold insult, right? These are the same people, though, that watched God do miracle after miracle, plague after plague in Egypt, drown the Egyptians who chased them into the Red Sea, and then be like, well, God just wanted us to die out here. That must be what was intended. And here's Naomi saying in verse 21, the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? Well, whose fault is it? Does it matter, though? That's the second question. A lot of times when we face tough times, we look for someone to blame. Maybe it's me. Maybe it's someone else. This world is difficult. It's not fair. Bad things happen. The question is, who can make it better? Who has the actual goal for us? Who has what we need? It's only and always going to be God. God delivered food when his people needed it. Physical deliverance when they needed it. Spiritual blessings. And it doesn't matter who I am, where I've been. We see this in the Corinthian letter. Basically, the worst of the worst people were part of the church there in some ways. And what was happening there? They could be washed, sanctified, justified. God has what we need. And when we start feeling inadequate, good, let's look to God. And when we're blessed, good, let's look to God. When facing tough times, be thankful that God is there for us to get us through. When facing times of lot and having everything we need, be thankful that God is blessing us at that time. We control our reaction. God controls the world. All I can do is look to him and be thankful. And so, Andrew, as we wrap up chapter 1, we realize Ruth is going to be a good example in a sea of bad examples. And while that's rare from a biblical narrative standpoint, at least around the time of the Judges, it's going to stand out to us as we go through these chapters. Thanks for hosting this. I think this has been a really eye-opening experience.
Absolutely. Appreciate both you guys joining us for this study. We're going to get into chapter 2 next time, Lord willing. We're going to get introduced to the second hero of the story, and that is Boaz. And Boaz is going to kind of serve to introduce us to that, the kind of the remnant, the little bit of Israel that is doing everything right. And it's going to show really the ideal of what Israel could be. And it's going to be that union of ideal Israel of Boaz and the ideal foreigner Ruth that's going to come together to produce that Davidic line. So we're going to get to talk about that next time in chapter 2. Thank you guys both for joining us. Thank you everybody who's joining us in the audience. We appreciate your participation. We appreciate your enthusiasm for the Ecclesiastes study. Hope to have it again for the Ruth study. So thank you so much. We'll see you again next time.